I'm David Babs from 38 Degrees, and I thought before I throw out a few opinions to start the debate, I'd just start by stating an assumption, which is I think probably we'd all agree that any healthy functioning democracy is pluralistic and chaotic and requires a range of actors. So I think when we're discussing this and talking about the merits of particular systems, and I'm going to cut the section of my opening remarks where I offered a critique of the current EU system, because Andrew just delivered it way more succinctly than I could and listed all the same things. I think that's spot on. I think we're talking about something that will always be in flux and will always be contested, and that's about the nature of democracy, I think, in general, but certainly in an age when digital technology and digital cultures are interacting with it. So to explain quick, how many of you are familiar with 38 Degrees? Okay, I won't spend too much time explaining that, so I'm crossing out big sections of my talk as I go along. I guess the underlying assumption behind 38 Degrees when we launched was that the kind of media and political class narrative of citizen apathy was a bit too convenient. That our assumption was that there are a lot of people out there who cared passionately about issues that affected them, about decisions that were being taken on their behalf, but the reason they weren't engaging was less to do with apathy, with disinterest, than to do with a lack of appetite for engaging via the institutions and the channels that were available to them, for probably in lots of cases a mixture of good and bad reasons, a mixture of just dislike, grudge, cynicism, and a realistic assessment of how responsive those channels were, how much it would really make a difference. And what we tried to do with 38 Degrees was create a kind of organisation, a kind of platform, a vehicle for a lot of those people to make their voices heard, to engage with the political process, and more generally with decisions that affect them. 38 Degrees doesn't just target formal politics. We also campaign on company behaviour, on other levels of government and other institutions alongside that. And indeed, we've started experimenting with direct consumer action, collective buying, for example, where lots of 38 Degrees members work together to negotiate a better deal on their gas and electricity bills by forming a block and negotiating as a block with the electricity companies. So the basic characteristics of what we try to do with 38 Degrees are firstly to place a very, very strong emphasis on people power, both in terms of how we decide our campaigns, our members suggest and vote on our campaigns, and in terms of how we deliver those campaigns. So we spend very little time at events like this or in Westminster lobbying. It's about our members' voices and giving our members ways of pooling their resources to make change happen. We apply kind of community organising principles, really, but mesh them up with the internet. So it's about listening to people, it's about involving them in both decisions and in the actions that flow from them. It's about responding quickly and recognising that most people make most decisions in their lives just as much on the basis of urgency as of importance. And it's about that's no different with political campaigning or other forms of campaigning. People want to do things take action on the issues that are in the news where decisions are imminent, and so responsiveness is very important, which goes back to one of Andrew's critiques of the current EU system. And we're multi-issue, so unlike, I guess, a traditional NGO, we don't kind of have a policy remit of, say, human rights and say, oh, this is outside our remit. We go with where our members want us to go. So we're not value neutral. We've got 38 Degrees members tend to come together on the basis of some broad principles of fairness, of standing up for democracy, of Britain playing a positive role in the world, of human rights and civil liberties. But there isn't some kind of fixed, locked manifesto that is kind of owned by the staff team or a narrow group of people. Now, so far, in 4 years, less than 4 years, 38 Degrees has grown from when we launched having a couple of hundred email addresses that I'd gathered speaking at events like this, passing a clipboard round at the end, to now being an organisation that involves 1.2 million people. We call them members. You don't pay a membership fee, but I think that new notion of membership being denoted by participation, by contribution in terms of action and ideas is quite an important principle here, and one we might want to explore more in the panel discussion. So 1.2 million people who have taken action about 8 million times so far. That's included donating over £2 million to different campaigns. I think that's quite an important rebuttal to the slacktivism charge, and quite an interesting challenge to those who say there's no route forward on party funding except state funding or huge donations. We're seeing our members willing to put a significant amount of their money where their mouth is. We've I think, had a similar number of petitions pass 100,000 to the government site. I wish I had the exact number so we could check that. But I think as well, we could argue the toss really as to which platform has influenced government policy more as well. Certainly we can point to some really significant occasions where 38 Degrees members have helped shift government policy. Probably the most notorious is the plans to sell off England's forests, which went from being something that was being presented as a complete fait accompli to a situation where the minister responsible stood up in Parliament and apologised and accepted that the policy was a terrible policy. We're also seeing 38 Degrees members on other campaigns increasingly go offline. So we were very engaged in a campaign to challenge what is now the Health and Social Care Act. As part of that campaign, we secured reasonably significant amendments to that legislation. We were widely credited with being one of the things that triggered the government's listening exercise on the Health and Social Care Bill. But it did go through. After it had gone through, we then polled 38 Degrees members and said, okay, we kind of lost this campaign, what do you want us to do now? And they voted overwhelmingly to continue working on the NHS within the new legal framework that was being introduced. And we now have over 150 local campaigns covering about 80% of the population areas of England, focusing on each of the new clinical commissioning groups that have been set up as a result of that legislation, seeking to amend their constitutions to introduce greater safeguards around privatisation and public involvement. So it's an example of a campaign that started with an online petition, moved through all kinds of other tactics trying to influence the legislative process. Did so partially and imperfectly, so we ended up with a piece of legislation we don't like at all, and for which a lot of the original critique that was offered both by 38 Degrees and all the other players who were concerned, those concerns still exist. But our membership displayed a high level of pragmatism and commitment to that cause, and has now completely changed tactic in terms of donating to fund legal advice to identify what can be done on the ground, starting to organise local meetings, getting together to join committees and patient engagement groups on the local level. So a real kind of rich range of engagement through which hundreds of thousands of people have been participating throughout. So what do I think are the possible lessons from this kind of example, which has been overwhelmingly UK focused? We haven't done much at the EU level so far. What do I think the lessons of that might be for an EU level discussion? I think a really important one is that the popular input that organisations like 38 Degrees have offered in the UK have made for better policy, as well as increased the legitimacy of that policy. I think the forests example is an example of a policy that is widely acknowledged now even among its original architects, to have been a flawed policy, and it was changed thanks to popular pressure. It wouldn't have changed otherwise. Similarly with the NHS changes, I think they're still flawed in all kinds of ways, but they're definitely better than they were. Again, thanks to popular engagement. Legislators amending that legislation relied on legal advice, but was funded by crowdsourced donations from 38 Degrees members, and challenged the Department for Health's partial and misleading definitions of what the legal implications of the changes were. So it makes for better policy. I think secondly, and I think this is also really important in an EU context, third-party movements, things that operate outside the formal sphere but engage with it and seek to influence it, can play an important role and can in many ways both innovate more quickly and can connect with more people than formal processes can, and creating systems that are open enough to allow those organisations to have an input is important. But I think it's also about accepting that whatever structures the formal institutions create, there'll be people on the outside trying to hack those and innovate around them, and that's a healthy part of a democracy. I think something else that 38 Degrees has learned, though, but it's probably what I'd like to leave you with, is we found that, I think our analysis is that often the discussion about digital democracy, which I think now we should just call democracy, like it's here, it's happening, people's expectations are that one of the ways they engage with anything is online. Often the discussion is around systems and mechanisms, and the technology to enable those systems and mechanisms. And that's an important part of the discussion, but it's also about culture change within the institutions that we're talking about here. It's about a change in terms of people's expectations of how the level of engagement they have with institutions that affect them, whether that's an organisation like 38 Degrees, or a corporation, or a political institution, and about those political institutions catching up with those changes in expectations. It's about the legislators, the policymakers, actually wanting to hear from people and actually wanting to be part of that conversation. Because, and I think this is one of the big challenges that Ben faces with the government, the petition side. You can smell it when politicians don't really want to hear, when they're paying lip service, when they're looking for ways to avoid substantive engagement. And that, I think, is still, most 38 Degrees members certainly, but I think this is more broadly the case, it's still people's most common experience of engaging in these things. That's why I think people do go for third-party organisations they trust to allow ways to self-organise outside of those formal processes. So when we're talking about systems change, about mechanisms, about technology, I think we need to be thinking about them alongside culture, and also partly evaluating them in terms of what cultural change they will help drive, because in the absence of that, you're kind of storing up these tensions where you're opening up more and more means for people to engage without the people on the receiving end of that having the appetite to engage, and that just makes everyone more grumpy, really, and I don't think it leads to particularly good outcomes, although I also think it's probably an inevitable aspect of the process of change that we're going to go through. I'll be interested to hear what you think about that.